I'm back with another episode of Semi-Pro, this time with Richard Lewis, esports journalist extraordinaire, been a desk host for many an event back in the day, and perhaps most famous for bringing Thorin on as a regular guest for By the Numbers. That's a reference some people might get. And he
Yeah.
joins me today to break down some of the scandals in the CSGO scene, to consider the future for North American CS, as well as the future for the coaching role and some of the people that may or may not be filling those positions. So, first, before we get really started on any more pointed questions, I did want to ask about your general take on the ESIC investigation itself, because obviously this is something that people kind of got lost with when they were initially considering it. Is the last time ESIC really made the headlines for a lot of people was the investigation that they had into NIP when there was that whole nothing in PayPal fiasco where there was a pretty big sort of financial based scandal. And I was curious as to how what your take generally was on how that whole thing had gone down, like now that we're so far removed from it and we can sort of look to what kind of work they've been able to do since then. I mean, it's safe to say we're very grateful to have them, generally speaking, I would guess. But as far as essentially them turning around the public relations sort of image, because some people did take umbrage with the way that their report was handled. I was curious if you had any thoughts on ESIC specifically as a body before we get into some of the stuff that they've reported.
Yeah, so I was very critical of that report when it dropped, the NIP one, because obviously, I mean, first of all, there was just a lot around it before you even get to the substantive qualities of the report. That was like kind of fucked up, right? I mean, you had this idea that they were told there was a time frame they had to get it out in, and they were told that by like WISA, and that's. That entire relationship is complicated because it's MTG that fund ESIC, MTG being the parent company of ESL, DreamHack, ESEA, WISA, all of these groups. So they're pumping money into what needs to be a kind of, conflict-free independent body. And here, they basically gave them the deadline because NIP, being a founder member of WISA and obviously one of the bigger orgs at that time that was associated with the ESL brand and ESL project, they wanted that story to go away. And it ultimately, it's not that I believe ESIC wouldn't have maybe even arrived at the same conclusions. They seem to be very generous, let's say, in some of their interpretations and some of the things that were going on within the NIP organization at that time. But it immediately hinders your ability to do a good and thorough job. If I was told, hey, Richard, this story's got to go out in 48 hours. Here's 10 years of financial documents. Do your best. How many stones can you realistically turn over in a couple of days? So that's what happened to the ESIC guys. I think they were under tremendous pressure to get something out as quickly as possible and essentially make it go away. And the ESIC back then, compared to the ESIC now, it's very different. They literally, it was mostly just Ian. I know a lot of people have seen him recently on the HLTV podcast and stuff like that. I did his first ever interview in esports, like way back when I started the Richard Lewis show. I was around ESIC from the beginning, because, I thought it was a really good idea, and his credentials were impeccable. This is a guy who's been a sports lawyer on both sides of the aisle, so he's essentially investigated and penalized match fixers, people that bring sports, ethics into questionable light, and people who break rules and laws. And he's also been an appeals lawyer. So he's worked on appeals for athletes that have been given what he considers harsh punitive measures. How we ended up talking was we were at can't remember which Counter-Strike event it was. It was one in America. Might even have been a major, I don't know. And he just came out of the blue, pre-ESIC, said he wanted to get a beer with me. And very often, people say they want to get a beer, and what they actually mean is they want to get a fucking foaming latte or something, because they're some suit, they're a twat. He's not. He's a fucking, guy who actually wanted to have a pint and a proper chinwag. So we sat down, we got talking, and he was telling me, about how he wanted to maybe try and get an appeal in for the iBuyPower guys, which was something I felt very strongly about at that time, because he said that he felt the punishment was too strict, and any punishment with no appeals process is wrong. It's inherently wrong, and that's something I absolutely agree with. So we immediately hit it off. And when the ESIC project started, I was one of the guys that behind the scenes, in an almost ambassadorial role, was telling people, no, this isn't a secret ESL spying project or whatever they believe. Because people like Faceit and guys like that who saw ESL as, this axis of evil, the MTG leagues and stuff, they didn't want to sign up to anything that had money coming from MTG. They thought it was a grift. So I was kind of telling them, no, this could be really good for all of us. But people kept their distance. Developers kept their distance. People didn't really want to, kind of get on board with this project for those reasons. So when this NIP report dropped, I was like disappointed. I was very critical of them. I said, this is a pathetic, given what I know about it and talking to players and all the investigation I did, was a fairly pathetic whitewash, if we're being honest about it. But it did reveal certain things, and it did confirm certain things, and it did condemn certain things. It just wasn't as stern as I believe it needed to be, and I don't think it found everything. But it was hampered from the start. It was never designed to do that. ESIC now, they've hired staff. They've expanded. They have a much better presence in the space, to the point where they're not really as reliant on the paymasters anymore. They don't really, need to feel that additional pressure. I think, they're out there holding meetings with huge gambling companies to make sure people aren't match fixing on their sites. They're having meetings with developers. They brought in someone who handles dealing with the press. They didn't have any of this before. They didn't have this clout and this substance. So the reports that you're seeing coming out now are much, much better. And you'll notice not done to any particular deadline, except let's get the truth out there. So I'm a big proponent of ESIC and what they're trying to do in the space.
Bearing in mind that right now we're recording this before the follow-up investigation drops regarding the coaching ban specifically, I did want to talk a little bit about some of the, I guess, sort of the riffraff that has come off after the fact of the initial sort of investigation that came out. So we know that 37 coaches were initially banned. That was the number that was thrown around. And recently, LMBT of Fours was unbanned for, I believe, his offenses in mouse sports specifically. And at least this announcement that he had made on Twitter saying that it looks like his name was cleared in the involvement. And some people, I think, took initial reports or initial sort of people who were contesting the veracity of the reports initially, some coaches who came out with alibis like Robin and Gary and indeed LMBT, who, people had essentially looked at them and said, well, I kind of like this guy, or maybe I just side with him, or maybe I actually do genuinely, objectively agree with what he's saying as far as his alibi goes, or I at least think it should be investigated. And they took that line of logic to mean that, maybe ESIC didn't do as thorough of a job as possible. Now, the other sort of side for that, though, is since there's still more to come, and since presumably there's still more people who have been caught who have not been announced, or something to that effect could very well be lying in wait at the end of October when they drop the next report. I was curious as to essentially any predictions, or maybe you have some knowledge that you actually know that you want to speak on regarding how deep the rot has actually gotten in this particular case. Is it worse than the public generally suspects? Have they sort of looked at this and said, oh, it was just 37. It's a big number, but that's okay. Maybe some of them are also false positives and they can kind of whittle it down in terms of significance in their mind. Is it actually much worse, or do you think it's the worst is behind us?
Honestly, I think the worst is behind us. I don't think it's as big. I mean, my initial statements publicly were that we're going to see it being fairly widespread. And I think, 37 coaches at all various levels of the game, including some names attached to some of the top 10 teams in the world. That'll do you, I think. And they're continuing the investigation just to be absolutely thorough, because we know that this bug has existed for a while, a set period of time, and they're going back through all these older demos now. It's just to sort of put the nail in the coffin on the whole thing. It's about being thorough. They will find some more examples, but I don't think we'll get another 37 or a number even close to that. And I don't think the types of names we're going to see are going to be particularly earth-shattering, and that's without any insider knowledge. I could be shocked, But based on my understanding of how the investigation took place, I think we're definitely past the worst of it in regards to the coaching bug. Now, match fixing, that's something else entirely. That's gonna be a tough one.
So when it comes generally to not only the match fixing side of things, but also the coaching ban itself, there is the worry now, essentially, especially based on the fact that LMBT has said that his ban was wiped in some sense. That there's a concern that there could be false positives within the ESIC investigations, and
Mm.
obviously we've got other credible alibis I referenced earlier. Robin and Gary seem to have at least they've taken their punishments, but in a way, some things about the circumstances make you think that maybe they should be treated a little bit differently than some of the other people who seem to have used it whole cloth with the entire intent of actually abusing it for competitive advantages. Do you
Mm.
think that there's a chance that ESIC pulled the trigger too early on some of them, or maybe they should have been more transparent in how they handled some of the more like edge case scenarios in the cases of people like Robin and Gary?
I think this is pretty much how any kind of like mass investigation, mass disciplinary measure would work, right? I mean, this is the system working as intended. You've flagged your 37 names. I mean, there's no question that in the demos that were linked to, say, like the LMPT case, the bug is occurring. It's not a complete fabrication or an error in that sense. It's that he's then had the opportunity to provide supplementary evidence and via him and his organization that supported him throughout to basically say, like, listen, he didn't violate the rules. There was no competitive advantage. The bug occurred, but here's the evidence that shows actually no cheating took place. And as a result, ESIC have rescinded his punishment. Now, there's a few unanswered questions, because I remember looking at the LMBT case because he was one of the more high-profile coaches there, and I remember watching the videos, and there was definitely movement on the camera following players. So I don't know what the qualifying evidence he's given to ESIC is that's enabled them to say, actually, we're going to completely rescind your punishment. But then again, I don't need to know. I mean, I've got enough faith in ESIC as a body, as an entity, to believe that if they've rescinded and lifted the ban, there must be a very good reason for that. I don't think they're going to do it because they're worried about public pressure or pathetic threats of lawsuits. I've seen some organizations throw out there, and this is, for me, the thing that I hope everybody takes from this is that this is how it would work in sport. If the governing body would issue a punishment, then the team or the player would decide whether or not they think that punishment is fair, and then they would go through an appeals process and either get the punishment reduced or cancelled altogether. That's the normal process. So I don't think this in any way impugns ESIC's reputation or implies that they've done a bad job. I think the scale of the investigation was unprecedented, and the fact there have been no false positives in terms of the data, it's just we've got qualifying evidence and additional stories to consider, like in Guerry's case as well. This is what needs to be brought to the table, and bans and punishments need to be appropriately handled through that lens. I think this is perfectly normal. This is exactly what should be happening, and I don't think people should be critical at ESIC just because they issued a ban that then got overturned pending further investigation.
So switching gears a little bit to the PR statements or the public reaction generally to the whole overall event, and less so specifically targeting ESIC. I was curious as to bearing in mind we're a couple weeks out from the initial report, and there's obviously a follow-up coming, which is, in some ways, it's good to get like a capstone. We can sort of move on from the event entirely after that, in theory, but with knowledge of how deep the rot did go and how impactful it actually was. It feels like some people, though, have already moved on in a sense. And, obviously people's attention spans are very low now, but generally speaking, it feels like for an event this size, people should be reacting a little bit more maybe not emotionally, but at least they should be seeing it as more serious than it actually is. And it feels like maybe it doesn't have the gravity that it would have if it was players or if it was an actual third-party cheat detected or something like that. I mean, Thorin has argued, obviously, that people don't really even see it as cheating in the first place, and they see it more as bug abuse for whatever reason that is different in people's minds, it seems. Or maybe also because of the scale of the incident itself and the fact that it affects so many people that they have a personal reputation with or they have a personal affinity for. And another thing I thought was interesting is that you did draw parallels on one of the more recent By the Numbers to the iBuyPower match fixing and how we didn't really stop match fixing as a community. We didn't stamp it out there. It continued on after the fact, even though there was a very heavy-handed punishment by Valve. And so it wasn't even really that super successful in completely stopping it forever. And as a result of the fact that we never really were fully transparent about that, it's now come back up and there's an additional investigation going on in the North American MDL for that exact purpose. So do you think that particularly, I mean, it's a weird hypothetical to imagine because for something similar to the coaching bug abuse or the coaching cheating scandal to happen again, we would have to have some sort of bug that coaches can abuse. And odds are Valve is not going to make that mistake twice. But are we sort of threatening to allow history to repeat itself if there is another cheating or ethical breach scandal that happens sometime in the near future or maybe even the far future? Do you think we fully dealt with something like this, or do you think some bad actors are still in the scene that will take advantage no matter what and they haven't been fully ran out, so to speak?
It's going to be very tough to kind of get a handle on that until we really know what Valve are going to do. You know, remember, Valve put a statement out there saying they were going to wait for the ESIC report to drop and then make a determination about what they want to do with the future of coaching, you know, as an entity within the game itself, and whether or not you'll see coaching at Valve tournaments or indeed beyond. Because remember, it's Valve's intellectual property. They can just simply insist that to give out a tournament license, your tournament can't have coaches. I mean, that's something they absolutely could do. It would be unprecedented and in extreme, but I think you have to remember Valve are getting probably a little bit sick of all of the nonsense that's attached to their games. It's them that get hauled into court via class action lawsuits. It's them that'll be investigated by federal entities in the United States. So, you know, we've had skins casinos, we've had match fixing, you know, we've got more match fixing to come. I think there's not to mention all of the problems in Dota with China and Chinese match fixing and Chinese money of dubious origin. You know, Valve are probably a little bit pissed off by this stage and thinking, actually, one thing we've learned, we need to put our foot down and put it down hard. So there's even a chance coaches as we know them don't exist in a few months. That being said, let's assume Valve don't do that. Let's assume Valve are disinterested. So I think the one thing that's like disappointed me most of all has been kind of like the propensity that I've observed to you know of people to kind of support those who are dishonest. And this goes to the community, this goes to the organizations, it goes to the coaches themselves. Because there's only one, there's only one appropriate course of action when you've been caught cheating like this. And that is, first of all, if you're the cheater, you have to say, like, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it. You know, like, here's all the instances I've done it, cooperate with, you know, the investigation, just cop to the whole thing. And then you have to be removed from the competitive element within which you operate. I mean, you can't be allowed. I mean, in my opinion, if you're cheating as a coach and you've done it on multiple occasions knowingly, then the ban has to be pretty substantial, and you can't just be a coach in the interim. You can't. You know, you've proven yourself to be untrustworthy. I think most organizations, if they were behaving appropriately, they would get rid of you and they would go look for a new coach. I mean, that's just how it feels it would work in the real world in sports. It's not to say you can never be a coach again. It's not to say you can't do other jobs while you're waiting for the ban to, expire. But what I've noticed is a lot of coaches, first of all, just were like, like guys like Starrix or whatever, I don't even remember doing it. And then you have his organization, Hard Legion, who, were one of the worst offenders in terms of the sheer number of coaches they had that were abusing the bug. It's hard to believe that it wasn't systemic. They turn around and say, oh, well, we're keeping him. So they're not even going to ban him. They're not even going to remove him. So the optics of that are terrible. And then you have a community that are kind of like, well, what do we really know about whether or not they were doing it? And it looks like there were so many people doing it all at once. It's kind of okay. And so basically what we've ended up with is like, yeah, people are really fucking disinterested in something that has probably negatively impacted on the careers of dozens and dozens of pro players. There are teams that are going to have made roster changes based on the fact they lost games at key stages. There are qualifiers that this bug was used in. So that's a team maybe never competing at a significant tournament in their entire professional careers because the one chance they had to qualify for something has been taken away from them. People should be angry about it, but I don't know. I very quickly realized in Counter-Strike especially, if your reputation is of a certain size and stature, if you have a certain amount of fans, you just do what the fuck you want, and the fans will back it. Everyone will back it. Everyone will make excuses for you. Players that lie, cheat, misbehave, everyone will bend over backwards to kind of make excuses for you. I mean, there's even in some instances, players where they've got VAC bans at various points, and just depending on how kind of likable they are and how contrite they are, some people even say, yeah, maybe this player who's got a VAC ban should be allowed back. But that flusher who never got VAC banned and everyone says is cheating, he's a cunt, him. I don't like him. It's like people are all over the place with it. It's like there's no logical consistency whatsoever in esports fandoms, and no logical or ethical consistency among the players, orgs, or coaches themselves. I mean, the only person, that's an exaggeration, but one person I did see that was about as indignant as I was Yanko. He said he couldn't believe all coaches were keeping their jobs and orgs were keeping their jobs. And like keeping people employed that they had cheaters for, and that people were gonna refuse to accept the ban, and people were complaining about ESIC. It's like a very embarrassing and sad, sordid affair, honestly.
There's another angle to take on that exact point about whether or not teams should have been able to keep some of the people who were impugned in this sort of investigation, and that angle for me is something that I haven't seen discussed at all. It's the CSPPA's role, the Player Association, in sort of figuring out how to respond to the ESIC investigation. And maybe they're biding their time. There could be a more charitable view of it, but it feels like they've mostly fallen silent on this particular issue. And especially,
they do that though, right? I mean, that's the CSPPA's modus operandi right now, as far as I can tell. If it's players fucking over players, they're not interested because they have to represent those players. In their mind, the only people that can truly fuck over players are organizations and tournament organizers. They don't conceive of a world where coaches and players can fuck over their fellow coaches and players, which honestly that's happening with greater frequency now, with all of the opportunities players have for commercial aspects like owning teams and stuff like this. CSPPA absolutely aren't interested in fighting those battles.
Well, that's the thing is I was going to ask if it was more systemic or if it was simply a case of them being toothless, the fact that they haven't really responded to anything like this, because obviously the obvious case that you would make even before any of this sort of the coaching scandal came into play is, there's something that also made a big stink when it was announced or when it was taking place was that MIBR game, where obviously a huge number of individuals from both teams had vested interests in both teams. And as a result of that, you can't have that match take place due to the inherent conflicts of interest with the match taking place in the first place. And the fact that it was for qualification to a major or for competition to qualify for a major, that just made it worse in many respects. And that just made it a higher profile case. And, this is, I guess, another angle. You could also impugn Valve in the same way. I mean, they obviously had a very draconian response to match fixing, and then they obviously banned academy teams and said that they were not going to be, supporting that kind of movement. So you can't have multiple team organizations owning multiple teams and competing in the same events. Meanwhile, of course, it's totally fine for the CIS region to have tons of academy teams and sometimes play in similar qualifiers. It seems like they are playing by different rules, sort of like you alluded to there with the whole Starix situation and the fact that Hard Legion has got some seemingly systemic issues. So I guess the question here is like, since we can't really trust the CSPPA to take up this particular fight, and we can't even trust Valve to be particularly consistent with the rulings that they dish out. Is it just falling back to ESIC in this particular case, or do you think that there would be something that other individuals in the space that maybe don't have the all-encompassing power of some of these other entities, but still have some part to play, could do to improve the situation that we're finding ourselves in and to stop these sort of breach of ethics from happening again and again?
I'd like to see CSPPA take a lead on ethical matters. I'd like CSPPA, instead of, talking about stuff, and acting improperly as an agent behind closed doors and doing what really looked like almost shakedowns on tournament organizers, intimating that maybe players will boycott their event if they don't pay them a fee and things like this. I'd really like CSPPA to take a lead on encouraging players to understand things and their role in terms of their ethics and how they need to behave and they need to operate. The reality is they don't seem very interested at all in addressing players' roles in all of this stuff. I mean, think about, right, if the CSPPA cares about the rights of players, then surely it has something to say when players violate the rights of players. So, for example, when MIBR play against their academy side in a qualifier for the World Championship, potentially having influence over the outcome. Or what about when an MIBR player threatens another player? Or what about when they publicly accuse another professional player of cheating against them in a tournament, leading to that player now never being able to attend a tournament in Brazil for fear of their lives? I mean, the CSPPA doesn't care about any of this stuff, apparently. And it should, because you represent that player too. So when players are doing things to harm players, you have to take those players to task. You have to set up a behavioral framework. I mean, if you go and look at any professional sporting association, by the way, any players association, they're not just telling the league how they need to operate. They tell all of their members how they need to operate. Like, go look at, for example, the role players associations have played in dealing with other players racially abusing other players on the pitch. They get involved. They make sure that the members who are the victims of that negative behavior are looked after, treated fairly, have access to the tools they need to pursue justice. CSPPA is not interested in that. What it's interested in is essentially consolidating power with players in their thinking about them as being an asset, essentially, and an asset that they can leverage if they have them all collectively. They're not really an association in that sense. They do come across more of almost like an agency in the way they've operated. And I think the biggest disappointment for me in Counter-Strike has been what the CSPPA has turned out to be. From the early days of watching my good friend Sir Scoot set it up and get it over the line, it was history in the making. Esports had never had anything like that. Esports, the whole thing, not just Counter-Strike. It was all done in Skype groups and Discords and like email chains, and that was the closest we had to unions in any competitive discipline. This was history in the making, and then you look at what it's ended up becoming, and just how Just the battles it chooses to fight aren't the ones that are going to necessarily make esports a better place for players, for fans, for everyone. Actually, in a lot of instances, this just seems to be about a consolidation of financial power. And while I think players definitely deserve to get their paper and be paid what they're owed and go to tournaments and have humane working conditions and humane competing conditions, I think we were already making great strides in that regard without the CSPPA. But there was a bunch of other stuff we really needed to focus on, and unfortunately the CSPPA doesn't seem to be too interested in those things.
One thing that the CSPPA has managed to do is seemingly get its reputation dragged through the mud in the last couple of months to the last year or so in general, because obviously there was a lot of fluff about the fact that we had a situation where there was that Vakarm article that went into this that I know you're familiar with because you talked about it on one of the recent By the Numbers, where they were, pressing people on whether or not the CSPPA truly was acting as an agency in addition to an association, and that is something that you also alluded to, them more or less acting, generally speaking, as a role, not just like this is almost a systemic thought or purpose for the association itself, not just a one-off incident. It seems to be just their modus operandi in some capacity. And I guess more recently, and it seems a little bit more of a fluff kind of complaint, but they have the team rankings that seem to be completely discarded by most people, most analysts in the space. So one of the things that it had potential to really help how tournaments are seeded or how invites are doled out, and something that in theory all players could agree upon, would have been something that could have made a positive change for the actual well-being of players, and especially in a situation where you're constantly competing and there's almost no answer to the almost no end to the onslaught of tournaments that we've had to endure during the pandemic, right? And so another thing that I think was a bit more famous as my own personal sort of like flashpoint, where the situation comes up and you have Davey mentioning that the CSPPA never approached tier 2 and tier 3 players. Like that was my initial spark for getting on the CSPPA sort of just investigation myself. Like I looked into them after that, and I was trying to figure out, like, I mean, that's literally what they're supposed to be doing. So if they're not doing that, and we have a pro saying that they're not doing that, and then we get more evidence that maybe even some tier 1 pros were never really approached or never fully included in that discussion as well. I mean, that's a pretty damning comment to make, and something that doesn't seem to have been countered at any point, especially considering the fact that the coaching bans and now the match fixing scandals disproportionately in some ways impact the lower tiers of Counter-Strike. This is a situation where in theory the CSPPA should be able to step in and have some of its most powerful impacts to help try to shape that scene and recover and assist in the rebuilding that has to happen now that we've lost so many people. So like, do you think that has there really been any changes, do you think, in terms of their focus on tier 2 or tier 3? Is there anything that you think might be a silver lining, or is it more or less as bad as it seems to be?
The sad reality, based on my understanding of how the CSPPA actually operates, they're not even really focusing on the tier 1 players. What happens is they have a board, and there are names on that board that they basically write statements for and say, you're happy for us to put your name on this. And then and they need those guys, because those guys obviously are the big influential front and center ones. They're the ones who come out and go, no, this ranking's really good, even though it's complete bollocks. And they're the ones who say, oh, the CSPPA have done all these amazing things for us, when in reality, so far, not really a lot has changed in terms of how players are treated at tournaments. That there hasn't been like a great, revolutionary change. Like TOs were treating players pretty well, by and large, even at the time the CSPPA was implemented. It's great to codify it. Don't get me wrong. It's great to have it in a contract, but that isn't a significant change in my mind, because these things were already happening. Players were already playing one series a day. These players were already, getting hotels and with practice PC set up for them in the hotel room. They already had green rooms with fresh fruit and water and anything they want brought to them. It was like these things were already happening for the players. and that was true back in 2016, 2017 when E-League started doing it. So, and I know because I was there. So, what the CSPPA has really been doing, it seems to me, and what they probably seem to have a bigger focus on, I think, long term, is, I know they said they're like, oh, we're not going to do any more agency work behind the scenes, but they still have ties to that agency group that operates independently. That seems to be what they're more interested in, because there's no real money in a players association. They've been able to command fees. I don't know how much longer that can realistically go on for, because a player's going to go on strike. Like, if there's ever a beef between the players and ESL, are you going to boycott 80% of the calendar? Like, what are you going to do? You're just going to be sat around twiddling your thumbs. And then the people who employ you, the orgs, they're going to say, well, if you're not going to orgs and you're not advertising our sponsors, we don't need to have you on the books. So now you've lost your salary. Like it doesn't really seem that there is as much power there as they think they have.
Yes.
Because unless you're willing to withdraw your labor from something, unless you're willing to take strike action, you don't really have a lot of leverage. So I don't know, man. It just seems to me that the CSPPA are like very interested in kind of leveraging the players, the big names they've got that they've given like board positions to, like Zipnix and Taco and Lige, having them front and center saying everything's great. But in reality, they're not actually doing, from where I'm stood, they're not doing a lot for the players holistically. Certainly not in tier 2, and not even the rest of the tier 1 players. And keep in mind, as I said, on the Semi-Pr0 issue, or just on player ownership in general, on conflict of interest at tournaments in general, in cheating instances, it's tier 1 on tier 1, right? It's not like it's not, this is a problem that affects everyone holistically. CSPPA are nowhere on this issue, so yeah.
Well, I mean, another case to be made as well is just the fact that they have board members in competing teams who are active competitors against one another and against tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 pros, now that the online era has opened up the field of competition a little bit more, especially. I mean, in a way, that's almost a conflict of interest in and of itself, considering the fact that in theory, if there was policy to be made that these, board members had some sort of sway over, and it wasn't purely, press releases signed on the dotted line, the concern would be that if the one policy improves the chances of my competitor finding success over me, and I have the ability to change that, that's at least a consideration, right? It's not necessarily impugning the reputation of the players, but it's just putting them in a position where you have to consider that as a potential motivation for them. And there's plenty of ex-pros, plenty of now broadcast talent or something to that effect that have moved on from their time in the professional career that in theory could serve as board members and could offer up even more full-time services in a sense, where they're able to say, hey, here's some advice to up-and-coming pros, or here's, almost acting as a bit of a liaison where that this person isn't just a suit. They actually have played the game. They've clocked in all the hours, and you can go back and, in many respects, people like, Nothing and Sean Gares, these people have their own sort of histories that most up-and-coming professional players are at least tangentially aware of, if not, people who they grew up watching themselves and gave inspiration in that sense. So what do you think about the fact that the board members themselves are active competitors? Because that to me was like a big shock to find out myself in looking at it like that.
Well, I mean, obviously, everyone knows that you can't do it. I mean, we had a ridiculous situation that was very similar over in League of Legends, right?
Yes.
Where you had that issue where Lena had the vice president of TSM had like leaked that nobody wanted to sign Dardoch, a player who basically which only happened because she's in a sexual relationship with one of the players she has direct dominion over, and it was on his personal stream. She was talking about it in the background, proving it was a conflict of interest, despite what every moron in esports seemed to conclude that it wasn't. And that player's career was completely fucked up at that point, because if you've got somebody saying actually no one wants this guy, turns out your agent going out and trying to bargain for you and get you a contract, he's got a much harder job now. And if he wanted to put in a complaint about it, well, he'd have to go to the LCS Players Association. And it turns out that not only are there TSM players on the Players Association, but also co-owners of TSM on the Players Association. So how seriously would his complaint be dealt with? It's another level of conflict of interest that's a huge problem. And certainly, I agree with you. I don't think you can have active competitors making decisions on stuff like this. Like, for example, the CSPPA did fuck all for Jampy, right? They basically, I think, sent an email to Valve, and I think that was it. That was the extent of their interest. But how can you have, let's say, for example, Astralis players making a decision about how all in they're willing to go to get a player who will go and play for a rival team and make that rival team better? How can you have them making the decision about how far all in they're willing to go to get him unbanned? Obviously, it's not in their interests that there's another sick player available playing for a rival team. So this is why you can't have active pros sitting on board positions and making, decisions. Again, how can Taco, make a decision about whether or not it's appropriate for someone to own a team or not when he does that very same thing? What if wanted to complain about something when he's a co-owner? Yeah, it's just fraught with peril, and it's so very typically esports that we've got just conflict of interest laid upon conflict of interest laid upon conflict of interest, and nobody actually cares about resolving any of those issues at all. So yeah, I agree. I think what they should have done is they should have got retired ex-pros to sit in board positions, and there's plenty of them, and plenty of them that would welcome the opportunity to stay involved in the scene.
One of the other cases of tier 1 on tier 1 action that you alluded to earlier was actually started off on Twitter. Glaive, or maybe his ghostwriter, his social media manager. We're not sure who yet, but somebody tweeted comments on Glaive's account, and the comments were about Cadian and about the heroic lineup, and they came off the back of Nicola Nyholm's infamous tweet where he, some people might say he offered them out and said, "Hey, Heroic, come to my office so we can have a bit of a brawl."
Say it to my face, fucker. Yeah. Pathetic, right?
So, off the back of that, Glaive's tweet alleged that Heroic players may have known something about the Hunden's bug abuse, and the fact that, with Hunden cheating, essentially the not so subtle subtext of that whole tweet or that exchange in general was that, Glaive was accusing them of having some knowledge of it or involvement in it in a way that cannot be corroborated through evidence. And, obviously right before, as some people pointed out, right before they had to, Astralis had to play Heroic in a pretty high pressure match to decide who moves on to the rest of the tournament. So in a situation like that, I mean, I guess it's kind of the other end of the public being apathetic or kind of just forgetting about it and having that goldfish memory, is they essentially might go too far the other way and start witch hunting without the proper evidence to really back up some of their assertions or some of their claims. And despite the fact that obviously the way that Glaive approached it was very clearly ill-advised, like very clearly not the way that you would want to do it, and if you're trying to be an ethical human being and an ethical competitor, I do want to ask the uncomfortable question. It's unlikely for us to ever really find damning evidence, but should players themselves be suspected for knowing their coaches cheated or having some involvement with it?
Listen, I think it's the next level of the investigation. Should ESIC want to pursue it, it's just going to be nigh on impossible to prove without voice comms. And I don't think there's a lot of those available from the type of competitions where the bug was being leveraged. Certainly, we're talking about instances that happened years ago. So I think, listen, in certain instances, it's almost certain that the players knew what was going on. I'll refer you again back to Hard Legion. But almost certain isn't certain, and almost certain isn't grounds to issue any form of punishment. Let's just call what happened with Glaive and Astralis and Heroic, let's just call it what it is. It's a Danish team that are publicly traded, that have another rival Danish team that were above them in the world rankings, that had just won a major tournament without using the bug, and they saw an opportunity to try and discredit them, to try and leverage the community to pressure them, to try and potentially have ESIC investigate them. It's cynical. It's got nothing to do with fairness. They didn't call out FaZe that supposedly used the bug against them. I think there was another team that used the bug in a game against Astralis. I can't remember which one it was. They specifically called out Heroic because they are a territorial rival. That's it. That's how Nicola Nyholm operates. He is a cynical piece of shit. And the way Astralis is run, they very often put the players out there front and center to do things on their behalf for their machinations. It's just what they do. It's just the players, the players get told what to say. The players get told what to do. We know that. We have evidence of that. Multiple occasions. There's always an excuse whenever the org does something questionable. It's always the players that come out and go, oh, no, actually, it's me. I'm not feeling very well. And I get jet lag when I fly in one direction, but not the other. And yeah, here's Zonic to explain the roster changes. And, you know, just whatever they do. Like, they are just garbage. And they treat their players like garbage. And this was simply about trying to re-establish themselves as the number one in Denmark because they're a publicly traded company now and their share price has been fucking plummeting because obviously it was always going to. So, yeah, it's got nothing to do with fairness at all. It's just classic, cynical Astralis, classic Nicola Nyholm. I want to be number one. I want to control everything. You know, he's in the headlines again. Turns out he was trying to make a rival to CSGO. Right, he was trying to make his own game, so he'd be the developer, he'd control everything. You know, he tried to have his own league where he controlled every brand and team within it. Before that, he wanted to run the player union. The guy is demented in his need to control things, and yeah, this was not. That was not about let's get to the bottom of an investigation and find out whether or not the players cheated. That was there's another Danish team that are above us in the rankings. How can we knock them down a peg or two?
I'm always curious about like historical context and how some players or some maybe the general public as well sort of look at and interpret the legacy of someone. Like it's a bit of a dated example now, but when Olaf Meister was in FaZe Clan, there was a long period of time where people were still willing to give him a shot because of his legacy, and they weren't really looking at the current eye test that he was serving up. And I feel like it's not a gameplay a focused interpretation, but with Astralis acting the way that they have and behaving in the way that they have, I mean, in a sense, at some point you have to figure out when they start to tarnish the legacy of the players that have played under them, and at what point does that start to play a role in players' decisions to join the org or fans' decisions to support the org. And obviously, we talked earlier about public reaction and how some people have been willing to go to bat for people who had been dishonest, who had cheated in this cheating scandal. And in many respects, I guess you could draw a lot of parallels because of the fact that Astralis have behaved dishonest as an organization, as a team, and they've done a lot of things, both things that the general public doesn't know about, but also things that obviously has come out in one way or another or will come out soon. And in a situation like that, you know, I have to ask, at what point do you think that Astralis will simply fall off the cliff in terms of public relations? Because it seems to have been a very slow descent, if it's a descent at all, perhaps due to the fact that they are so focused on trying to control their own personal narrative. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel for that? Do you think that at some point they will have to start acting, behaving better and correct that error so that they can continue to win over the public?
The first thing there is, you know, that would require some self-awareness on their part. That will never occur. Unfortunately, what they've done is they've created a cradle of, hubris and narcissism among all of the people that work and represent their organization. You know, I think I saw their head of PR or something arguing with randoms on Twitter the other day because they questioned the roster move and called them out for this whole nonsensical, we want to build a 10-man roster, which they're still sticking to, by the way. Incredibly,
that's incredible.
Publicly, they are still sticking to the narrative. Now they're changing it slightly because before it was, we want a 10-man roster so we can substitute in every position. Now they're saying what they want is they want an academy team, which, of course, we know can't really operate in CS because they're not allowed to compete at the same events. So what would be the point in putting them in qualifiers, for example? But you would have to choose one or the other. So it's a lot of expense for not a lot of reward. So yeah, they're still sticking to their story. On top of that, I remember Casper Hvitt, the handball player from Denmark. He's doing interviews on Danish news sites saying, I don't know anything that goes on in esports. And he, who's just been in for like 18 months or whatever, he's the authority on the space. He knows best. He knows what's good for players, what's good for business, what's good for... he's a fucking lunatic. Like, I can't even imagine. Like, if I like went and took a job in like investment banking or something and like started telling everyone, no, this is how it all works, guys. Like, people would laugh me out the room. They would say, what's your experience? What are your credentials? What's your expertise? Yeah, we get these dickheads that come from other areas just because what? Like, you saved some money up. That's it. Well done. Congratulations. You're not the average sports moron that blows through all of their money and ends up fucking homeless and bankrupt at 30. Well done. Great. You've proven you can put money in a bank or invest it in stocks or whatever, or property or businesses or whatever it is. Well done. But that doesn't make you an authority on a business that's now been around for, like, if we want to go way back, 30 years. You don't know the first fucking thing about it. You just got here. Shut the fuck up. Let the experts be the experts. We say that for everything except esports. So when I see people like Casper Fit like talking about that stuff, and like people like Nicola Nyholm who have just told lie after lie after lie, been caught out lying, and then at no point does the penny drop. Like, I should just not lie next time. Like, let's put it this way. The things the community have let Astralis get away with are outrageous. Does no one remember they took $1 million from esports.com? A failed, Bitcoin-style ICO cryptocurrency, very shady company that had no tangible product, just made a white paper and was basically lying and trading against that. The former owners of that company are being investigated for financial crimes. So why did one of the premier organizations in esports partner with those guys? Why did you elevate them to having credibility when they're most likely criminals? And why is the community forgot that? Why are Astralis the good guys again? It's fucking ridiculous. Like Nicola Nyholm, yeah, we don't own multiple teams. Okay, tell a lie, we do own multiple teams. We never wanted a league where we were going to control all the teams. Oh, wait, no, we were actually. Yeah, okay. Well, don't worry, though. We would never overwork our players. Okay, yeah, we've got 2 players that have had to take leave from medical exhaustion. But don't worry, we're building a 10-man roster so it doesn't happen again. Oh, no, we're not. We're selling the players, actually. Like, what the fuck are you... like, how does anybody, like, just look at them and not just, like, double over in laughter at how inept their lies actually are? They get caught out every time. So, no, they would need to realize, first of all, that they're not as smart as what they think they are. They can't do it. Nicola Nyholm, because he's like worked for a big investment company, he's one of these people who, because they've got millions in the bank, everyone just licks their ass everywhere they go and tell, oh, you're so great, you're amazing. They're surrounded by sycophants, like, oh yeah, I'll fly you out in a helicopter and we'll have cocktails on the roof of a big building and you can tell me how great I am. Well, no, you're not. You're just another dickhead out of his depth running an org that's actually doomed to failure. Your share price is plummeting. You keep fucking everything up. It's gonna end up with them selling the brand at some point. And he's not gonna be able to control esports like some Machiavellian guy like he thinks he's gonna be. It's not gonna happen for him like that, and he's just gonna be in, be out, and then tell all of his knobby wanker investment friends about the time he almost had an esports kingdom, but God, that industry's just not ready for geniuses like him. So no, I mean, like, I don't think they should be able to win over the public. It's just Astralis fans, like a lot of fans. I mean, any fan in general. Fans are enclaves of mentally deranged people. That's what fans are. And it's worse in the internet era. So expecting them to have like some introspection and go, the people who run the thing I am a fan of maybe aren't that great. It's not going to happen. So Astralis fans will just they'll spoon feed themselves Nicola Nyholm's warm diarrhea and just be happy with it, and that's fine. But I hope the rest of the esports fans can see what a wretched organization Astralis are, how comedically inept they are at both enacting their plans for world domination and lying about it, and actually how they're likely to lose when their players' contracts are up. This dream Golden Five, one of the greatest cores ever in CS history, they're very likely to lose them. So, bookmark that because I told you so.
Well, one of the biggest sort of reasons to be an Astralis fan, if you can even still come up with enough, are those players, the Golden Five lineup that you're talking about, that, the greatest team of all fucking time, quote Saticus.
Yep.
And, that's a situation where it's a compelling enough reason that maybe you can look behind it, or you can have the sort of nuanced opinion that's probably a very rare take in esports, that the org is bad, but I really want those players to have some success. And
Which is how I feel, right? Like,
of course. And the question then becomes, when does the penny drop for the players? When do they realize that they've been had this entire time? It's not a player owned team the way that they were spun maybe initially when they were seeking funding.
I forgot that lie. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you can forget plenty of them. There's still a little too many. Yeah. So, like, when do you think that the players themselves are going to find a situation that feels right for them to go? Because it seems like it was close. Zipnik's had that like sort of a mysterious, enigmatic tweet about writing a book about all the bullshit that's happened maybe in a few years. It seems like there's a lot of situations that may have come up more recently that may have allowed some or all of the main players to actually find another home under another banner that would hopefully be more reputable than Astralis and more honorable. But so far it hasn't happened, and that's been one of the biggest shocks to me in the whole Astralis situation. So what do you make of that?
Well, the penny's already dropped. I mean, I don't know how people can't read between the lines and see what actually happened there. But because you don't need insider knowledge like I have to be able to piece it together. You just need a modicum of intelligence and understanding about how the world works. But clear, right? Let's just have a look, okay? They get worked ridiculously, traveling all over the world, 4 continents in 42 days, winning all these tournaments. They then come back, ask for a holiday, get told no, right? Then, because of COVID, even though there's no real viable reason it should be having as profound an impact on esports as it is on other endeavors, they get essentially told you must take a 30% pay cut. So then the players, mysteriously at this time, that's when the burnout kicks in. Not actually when they were getting worked ridiculously, but after the fact, when the pay cuts are coming in and everything else. And only after Zipnik's, who was instrumental in setting up the CSPPA, personal friend of Mads Oland and the Danish guys that run it over there, only after some consultation with those guys about what the best course of action is. The burnout kicks in at that point, and everyone goes, "Oh, Richard, you're such a piece of shit for speculating about the burnout." Something can be both true and convenient, right? So I'll speculate as much as I fucking want. Thank you very much, actually. You guys can blindly just follow narratives if you want, but I don't do that, which is why, I've done so much good investigative journalistic work. I have a little inkling or two. All right, but you want to follow publicly available narratives, you do you. It's not for me. So then, at that point, they then decide we need to get this incredible 10-man roster project going. They go to their old organization, Heroic, which were in the process of getting a very... that looked like there was going to be a big sale there to a big financial backer. What's that? They floated on the stock exchange, and having a better Danish rival could really negatively impact on their share price because they could no longer make the claim that they were the number 1 org in Denmark. Right, very interesting. Remember, they floated on the Danish NASDAQ. So that deal gets scuppered by Heroic players going across. Now, was the 7-man roster ever real, or were those players brought in to essentially say to the players that were at this point burnt out and not playing for the org, actually, you're not irreplaceable. We'll just bring in other players. Interesting. You figure it out, I guess. And then, as soon as those players come back, and during that time, I know at least one of those players had negotiations with other organizations. Now they decide, we don't need that 10-man roster anymore. Let's sell those players for a profit. Fuck me. How stupid are people?
Well, the question has to be asked anyway, because of the fact that there's so many, like you say, there's truth and convenience can line up in that sense. And
sure,
so many people have.
But that's not what happened here.
Of course, yeah.
What happened here was a deliberately, those players that came in, for Astralis that came in from Heroic. I don't know what they were told. I don't know if they were told, hey, like, we really want to use you as subs. We really want to do this. They were essentially scabs. You know, they were breaking a strike. You know, well, it's absurd to even view it any other way. You know, Snappy, Yugi, are you fucking serious? Like, you know, come on. These players aren't heroic caliber. They were never going to stick around. We just had to keep in mind as well, it's super important that Astralis meets all of its financial commitments now, i.e. attending tournaments, because we had those back then. If they don't get to the tournament, they don't get paid the money. And if they don't get paid the money, they now have been irresponsible towards their shareholders, and that could create a big problem. So I just don't, like, okay, you know, if we need to pretend that, oh, the players just got burnt out and Astralis are this really nice organization, so nice that they decided in that instant we must go towards a 10-man roster so our players can take protracted holidays and we don't mind doubling our salary bill to do that, or was this like, no, that's not what happened. It's just not what happened, is it? Anyone can see it's patently absurd. So I think the penny has dropped. I think the penny dropped the moment they essentially went and got a doctor's note and said, like, yeah, we're burnt out now. Sorry, fellas, we're not going to play for you. And it happened ahead of them having to go to a tournament that they were financially and contractually obligated to attend. And then they had to bring in, you know, ringers, essentially. You know, Yugi and Snappy were never going to stick around. They had to publicly lie about it and sell it. And then the players have gone, oh, shit. We you know, they literally are just going to keep going and keep playing without us. Been out there, tried to maybe get moves away, hasn't happened, and now they've come back. But remember, their contracts are going to expire. Like, there is zero chance, in my opinion, as close to zero as I think is feasible to say, you know, ahead of time, that when their contracts are up for renewal next year, I think it is, that they stick around.
Well, that was going to be my next question anyway.
It's abundantly clear to me that the players clearly aren't happy with the way things are over at Astralis. And they're doing a great professional job, the players, Glaive, Device, all of these guys. You know, these guys are consummate professionals, no doubt about it. They're going on podcasts and saying everything's all right. Everything ain't all right. People talk in the Danish scene, man, like, and I hear that shit. So there's, you know, they're not happy. And they know they can get more money, more status, and better working conditions elsewhere. And that's what they're going to pursue as soon as they're able to do it.
I wanted to switch gears to have a sort of a final word on the whole coaching scandal thing before we move on to the North American side of things and the match fixing that's been investigated. Mm-hmm. And one of those last sort of comments that I wanted to get from you was some sort of talk about rebuilding the coaching role, assuming Valve doesn't ban it, assuming there are no punitive actions taken on coaches that have a knock-on effect that stop the coaching role from being considered at all. The fact that we have lost so many, and some of them being quite high profile, but even the ones that weren't, in theory, were providing some sort of service when they weren't cheating, and helping to build up the team and to instill this sense of, like, maybe those people would have been the Zonics and the Hundens, you know, given enough time, a couple of years down the road. And now we've sort of missed that potentially an entire generation of talent, which obviously, you know, you remember from the CGS days would be quite disastrous to happen again now if it were to happen again. And something obviously similar is threatening to happen in NA. Some people have said it's already happened. But when it comes to the coaching thing, like, as a sort of a layman or somebody who only really recently started paying heavy duty attention to what goes on the teams and behind the scenes, I feel like, you know, coaching was always something that was less impactful than it could have been in esports generally, but in Counter-Strike as well, considering you do have that opportunity to speak during the timeouts, and you can actually really course correct or figure out some way to fix a team's mental or to fix a team's strategies where you see something that the players themselves couldn't see because they're in the server and you're just watching from, like, you know, from behind them in that sense. And considering that we might miss out on that generation of talent for coaches, do you think that, like, it's going to be a difficult ask to rebuild the coaching role generally, or is that something where you have a little bit of faith in people who can come up and sort of buttress the fact that we've lost so many?
I actually think a lot of the coaches that we, not just the ones that were embroiled in the scandal, but, you know, coaches in general, I think they are not actually a great example of what coaches are in esports. I think we're way behind where we should be in terms of the coaching role. There are some coaches I know that actually fulfill the role of a coach. Zonic, Threat, people like this, Yanko. These guys actually do exercises that are akin to what a sports coach would do. I'm missing some names, so apologies if anyone watches this and goes, why didn't he mention me? But there are some who are just a bunch of fucking glorified water carriers, just washed up cunts that are kept around, for nostalgia's sake. I'll say this. I'll add Hunden, who I talked to ahead of the ban and after the ban, as being a good example of a coach. But there are many that I'm very, very dubious about doing it. Like Dead's no loss to the coaching profession. Does anyone think Dead actually does any coaching?
He seems to be more of a manager from the outside anyway. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, the fact that he was ever on the server with them in the first place was ridiculous. And the idea that Fallen's ego would ever allow, anyone to tell him how to play the game or give any input that he would listen to, in the same way that, I'm very dubious about, Rallen, given the egos he's got to deal with and, Regin, people like this. It's like I don't know how good coaches these guys really are. I think it's for me. It's very tough to assess. Now I'm not around them, 24/7, but I definitely am dubious about some of the coaches and some of the people that have enjoyed the label of coach. So I actually think getting rid of a bunch of those guys is a good thing. I hope we get a new wave of coaches coming through. We've got a very talented generation of players about to fall off the edge of viability. I'm talking about guys like Neo. I'm talking about guys like Taz. I'm talking about guys like Adrian. Like these are players that I don't think they're gonna go to Valorant to try and extend their glory years by another year in a different game. They probably could, but those are the kind of guys I would like to see progress into a coaching role. And there's a lot of coaches that I'm a little bit dubious about whether or not they're actually real coaches, whether or not they understand how to coach, occupying a lot of roles. And I think we're going to see more and more people, even people like, Moses moving from being a commentator, moving into the coaching role. I think that's interesting because I think it's an indictment on the types of coaches that we actually had, that people can come externally and from other backgrounds and go straight into high level coaching roles. I think it just says that it was one area we never really excelled in. And I think this cleaning house, it obviously serves the first purpose of getting rid of all of the cheaters, but then it also serves the purpose of enabling a new generation of coaches to get some opportunities and hopefully better coaches, because there's a lot, I think, that are just cruising on name power or ties to players, being a nice guy. And that's not what a coach should be doing,
Well, that's a more optimistic take than I initially expected. So maybe you can also repeat and hit me with another one for this one. This is obviously for the North American scene, and we're going to be seeing a cleaning of house with the MDL teams that have been that are being investigated currently. That's a situation where a lot of them may have already moved on to Valorant, as you were talking about. A situation where a lot of them may then sort of earn the ire of Riot Games themselves because of the fact that now they're bringing in some sort of negative headlines. But putting that to one side for now, sort of a similar question about the generational talent gap, because when you take away tier 3 and tier 2, or you somehow reduce the number of players or the number of teams or coaches that are able to actually provide maybe not direct competition, but enough of a sort of hyperbolic time chamber to train the next level of competitors for that particular region. It's a very easy thing to have that bottom out. And at some point, you will get the top teams who are past their prime. The players are no longer really shining as brightly as they could be, but there's nobody there to come in and have them sort of the one star cannot be the in-game leader or the veteran that can provide the team morale, sort of like what we've seen Tarek do in his sort of later years. and you don't really have the opportunity to have a Breeze or an Ethan or a Cirque come in behind them and in the same situation. So do you think that North America's solution to this will end up being importing players from afar? Do you think there is a real solution to this sort of thing, or is it even that much of a problem, as much as people have made it out to be?
I think what we're going to see happen is there's only going to be the big, established, talented esports organizations in North America stay in CS for the duration of travel restrictions for the pandemic, and probably through most of 2021, honestly, even if we get to a place where the travel restrictions are lifted. There's attitude among North American owners right now that there's not a lot of value in Counter-Strike, because North American owners in general are bums. They're just lazy. They don't. They are used to the franchise system of sports. They don't like relegations. They think if they invest money, they should be guaranteed some form of return. They're risk adverse. And in Counter Strike, unfortunately, with its open circuit tournament, you can have a team, you can pay them a really high salary, and they can never, ever, ever go to a major tournament because that's how we do things. So a lot of the North American owners have been looking for an out for a while. It started out with the usual array of like losers and jokes. They were all out there like, we don't want to support a CS team because it's very hard to get sponsors because of terrorism and that. Like, just making up any excuse, to get out, basically to try and cloak their own failure. And now that attitude has gone further and further up the pecking order because right now you can't travel, so you can't get to the prestigious tournaments. And a lot of these NA owners have had a taste of, the Call of Duty League. I won't say the Overwatch League, but they've had a taste of like the LCS and the Call of Duty League, where it's like you can't get relegated. You have like live events. You're making you get a decent return. There's big sponsors attached to it, and you're going to be there year upon year, season upon season, with very little risk. That's what they like. So now that we've got like a new game that you can kind of move your mediocre CS talent to. And they also trust that Riot are going to build a franchise league around the esport in a year or two. You can take that money that you would need to have not even a particularly competitive Counter-Strike team, and that would constitute a very good salary in Valorant, and those mediocre players would constitute being very good in professional Valorant, because we haven't really established the skill ceiling yet. Suddenly, the NA owners think that's a much, much better investment. So outside of like Cloud9, who are European now, Complexity, who are European now, you're going to have like Furia, who are Brazilian, but they play in NA. You're going to have, I'm loath to mention Semi-Pr0, let's not, Team Liquid and Evil Geniuses. And I don't think anyone else is going to be looking to get involved in CS until we know what's happening with Valorant and we can all travel again. Now, a lot of people are saying this means that like CS is dead. Well, no, that's patently absurd. It's the numbers are through the roof in pandemic era in terms of viewership and therefore eyeballs on your sponsors are up. It's just that the travel restrictions are the big problem right now. And I think the NA owners will go, they'll flirt with Valorant, and then when the established Valorant players overtake all of the CS failures and has-beens, and there will be some CS players that excel at that game, by the way, it won't be all of them, not by a long stretch, then they'll either think about coming back to CS or, they'll try and improve their fortunes in Valorant if there's a good franchise league over there. So I'm not too worried about what the future looks like. I think the match fixing thing's going to be interesting because it's going to prevent a lot of these players from coming back. I think that's the interesting part. There's a lot of these players going to go to Valorant, start out promising, fail, and then they're going to look to come back to Counter-Strike, but the fact that they've got match-fixing bans is going to mean that no one's going to pick them up. So they better be fucking good at Valorant. That's all I'm going to say. Because these shitters won't be welcome back in Counter-Strike.
Well, if you wanted to steelman the organizational or team sort of approach and their idea that they don't have the money or they're not getting the sponsors or something to that effect is hindering their growth in Counter-Strike, and that's why they're pulling out. They obviously recently a higher profile org that pulled out was 100 Thieves, the Second time they've come in and come out, this time a little bit longer than the first, of course, which is nice. But they actually played some games with the Australian roster, which was good. But when it comes to them pulling out in that sense and no longer being a part of it, I mean, one of the things that you almost always assume will be associated with any sort of report of a team either deciding or thinking about removing themselves from the CS ecosystem is that they don't have the money. Yet when obviously Valorant comes up, it seems like the salaries are disproportionate, maybe even higher than some of the CS salaries from the numbers that I've seen circulated. So
I've been trying to explain this to people, and you go on Reddit, and people are going, "Lol, this is wrong." No, but people are making way less money in Valorant. It's like, dude, there's a reason why dog shit CS players that have failed repeatedly on team after team after team on NA are so intrigued by going across to Valorant. It's not just a fresh start. It's not just a new opportunity to be good at a new game. It's fucking money. Money's the primary motivator for a lot of these people. And for whatever reason, North American orgs, well, for all the reasons I just said and some others, the North American organizations would happily waste money on Valorant, which doesn't even have a scene, based on what they think they're going to get if they strike gold and have the preeminent Valorant team going into the franchise league, than the money they would spend in Counter-Strike to not be able to compete against the European teams and the big dogs in the North American scene. It's just that simple. So I don't know why people are so find it so hard to believe that Valorant would be overpaying in salaries, but that's what's going on. So people don't want to listen to that for whatever reason.
Well, the concern that I would have from a team's perspective is that at some point, it seems likely, many have speculated anyway, that Riot is going to turn Valorant's ecosystem into a closed scene with leagues and stuff like that, very similar to League of Legends. And there's probably going to be franchising, and it's probably going to be a similar look with very few, if any, independently organized tournaments, very few, if any, international tournaments, regardless of who's organizing them. And maybe a lot of the same sort of things that you're going to see that you already see in League, that people already complain about in League, may end up also transpiring over in the Valorant space. Now, something that people don't usually talk about, especially in the NA scene about League, is that if you're not really in the league system, if you're not an organization that has fielded a roster, maybe two rosters, one for Academy and one for the main league, then you aren't in the ecosystem for that region, and you don't have access to those regional sponsors, and you don't have access to any of the benefits that comes with that. And if there's only 10 teams in the league, then that leaves out a lot of people who might be interested but can't because of the closed nature of the system. They can't come up and sponsor an Academy roster that runs in and tries to win via relegation to access that upper echelon. And so given that's the situation, I mean, you talked about pros returning from Valorant back to CSGO if the opportunity arises and if they aren't indeed banned via match fixing investigations. But my concern is more that somebody's going to take a risk at this point when it comes to the team side of things, and they're going to field a roster, and that roster either won't be good enough, or it'll be too much money, or they'll not get access to the league in some capacity because Riot doesn't choose them to be a partner. In situations like this, we saw this sort of thing happen with Immortals in many respects as well in the League of Legends system. Do you think that there's like a real case of people playing with fire, or are some of my concerns and some of the community's concerns kind of overblown when it comes to the future of some organizations and as they try to lay their claim to Valorant?
Look, I think the organizations are going to be fine. The good thing is there's enough what people have realized now is that you need the blend of influencers, so you can sort of put your lifestyle sponsors and stuff on them and have a permanent, persistent, ongoing reach, and having esports teams that are sort of vaguely competitive, or certainly at least have enough personality that the fans don't mind them losing so much. Think TSM, that dominate their region in League, absolutely dog shit at Worlds to the point of embarrassment. Got a lot of influencers, it's a good blend ultimately. It's the same like say 100 Thieves. They've got a bunch of influencers over there, some that have nothing to do really, or did have nothing to do with gaming, and you bring them in, and that's what you can pitch sponsors to. You'll be on their jersey as well as our team's jersey. So I think most of the organizations are starting to get a good handle on it now and understanding that what we've always needed to do is not just be pure esports or not just be like pure influencers and to try and find that blend. And it seems to be working out for the most part. So I think like there'll be plenty of organizations, like new bedroom organizations that come and
Yes.
fail. You know, plenty of that, right? I mean, everyone wants to get in on the great esports gold rush. But unless you have a serious financial backing these days and you're willing to essentially lose money for the first 5 years of your existence, nothing can succeed in esports without that will. And unfortunately, most people come in and they think they're going to break even at end of year one and turn a profit in year two. Complete nonsense. And especially if you're an organization, that's not true. So there's going to be people that are going to like fall by the wayside. I think that's good. That's evolution, right? Not every mutated species survives. Some grow gills when they're on land, and some have diminished libidos, but some get giant brains and opposable thumbs. It's just the nature of the beast. So yeah, I'm not too worried, and I don't think people should be either. The one good thing about esports is the market does have a tendency to sort itself out.
Well, something else is being sorted out as we speak, and it does seem to be that match fixing thing with the regards to the NA MDL. And this is, it's curious to me because I was actually concerned more on the European side when I initially had found any reports of MDL level, tier 2, tier 3 level match fixing. There's a lot of allegations going around with some of the, like, I think it was the Unicorns of Love team and some of the lower tier organizations in that area where, I mean, in theory, it makes even more sense for them because there's probably more eyes on the game as it might be a higher quality game, but there's probably less sponsors and less money for the players. And so there might even be more motivation to throw or fix anything. Obviously, I haven't seen anything come out since then that has corroborated or shown any evidence to any of those claims. But that was where I was initially expecting some of the issues to crop up. And yet, obviously, now we're seeing reports of the North American side of things and the MDL and maybe even some in other areas like advanced coming in and in those lower tiers of North American Counter-Strike having that problem of that rot within esports that we've seen time and time again. And this is something that I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much you could speak to the scale of it or how much insider info you even really have on this sort of subject. But as far as I've been, clued into, it does seem like it's going to be a large portion of the teams implicated in this, even if it's only one player or one coach or one analyst associated with one of those teams, and it's not the entire team in general. Like a lot of the brands there, a lot of the organizations, some of which are closer to bedroom than they are to established, are going to be impugned in this sort of situation. So like this goes deeper than just the players or the coaches or whoever's directly implicated, because this could end up tarnishing the limited image that we have of some of these more recent up and coming organizations. What do you think the results of something like the ESIC investigation here are going to actually be?
So there's a bunch of thoughts on the match fixing issue. I mean, like you talked about earlier, right? We say that the iPad Power ban didn't fix match fixing. Not entirely true. What it did was it stops any player who ever has an inkling that they might be good enough to play at the highest level.
Yeah.
It stops those guys from match fixing. It stops established talent from match fixing. But if you're a shitter playing in an amateur league and not being salaried and essentially playing for fun and very limited amounts of prize money, sometimes not even prize money at all, sometimes prizes, mouse mats, keyboards. These people, match fixing is rife at that level. Absolutely rife. And it doesn't need to be because it's completely fixable. It's fixable tomorrow. You simply put the betting companies shouldn't be housing these games at all. They should be only housing tier 1 tournaments. They're that desperate to get a piece of the esports action, though. I can go on a reputable licensed betting site and see a Mountain Dew League game on there. Are you fucking kidding me? It's ridiculous. And it's like the betting companies have approached esports with the same way they approach like real sports. Like, listen, match fixing still happens in big time, collegiate sports even. Okay, like there's recent examples of that. We've got examples of match fixing happening in tier 1 football tournaments around the world. We've got refs being caught out, being involved in that stuff. So obviously esports is never going to be immune, same as no sport around the world is immune. But come the fuck on, this is like putting on pickup games. It's nonsense. They shouldn't be on a reputable betting platform. That would stop most of it. Now, I've been conducting my own investigations into this for a good long time now, and I'm sharing my findings with ESIC and other entities. And basically, I'll just tell you straight up: the reality is it's amateur hour. It's amateur hour. These kids that are out there fixing matches, they can't cover their tracks in any sophisticated or meaningful way. They think like giving their making an account in their like parents' name or something like that is going to be enough. And I've got people from all over the globe that message me, this match is fixed, here's the swing in the betting odds and stuff like this. And like I say, I pass that information on, and you'll see a lot of games that get pulled because of irregular betting patterns. And I talk to as many people as I can to make them aware of it. But what's about to happen is that because it hasn't been nipped in the bud, because people haven't stopped it, because the gambling companies have kind of been a little bit like lax and allowed it to continue. I'm telling you, the police are coming. The feds are coming. It's fucked. It's over. People are going to go to jail.
This is something that I think happened in Australia, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. People were at least investigated by the police.
They're from Australian Mountain Dew League games now, they're looking at 10 years in prison, which I don't think they'll get the full sentence, but be very surprised if they don't do a bit. And people need to be asking yourself, it's not, well, I was never going to play at a major anyway. Now it's, you're going to go to fucking jail for this. I've said it many times on By the Numbers. I said it on streams. All these people fixing matches. You don't want to be the first kid. Think about how the book got thrown at iBuyPower to make a statement.
Yes.
You don't want to be the first North American match fixers to go to jail for esports match fixing. You do not want that. Because it is not going to be a reasonable sentence. It is not going to be commensurate to what you've done. You are going to get absolutely fucked. And I will tell you, I know there are a lot of people right now just sweating over the ESIC investigation, and I am telling you that is the least of your worries. If you are match fixing, you need to stop. It is not worth, and I've seen the money that comes back on these things. Mate, it's a pittance. It's nothing. We're talking like, they're putting, because they have to put small bets on to not alert people, and they have to do it on multiple platforms. So, you're talking like maybe $1,000, and then you've got to divide it up with all the parties. What the fuck are you doing? You're going to go to prison for that. That's fucking ridiculous. You're better off getting a summer job, you fucking idiots. You know what I mean?
It's something that won't send them to jail anyway.
Yeah, preferably. But yeah, it's ridiculous. So, I mean, this ESIC investigation is I have no insight into it because I don't know how much of what ESIC's investigation overlaps with the things that I share with ESIC and other entities. We don't discuss that. It would be like obviously a potential violation. They need to keep it hermetically sealed so no one gets tipped off. And obviously I respect that. I've never asked them for any insider information. I simply provide my own where possible. So I don't know what's going to overlap and what isn't, but I'll just say, straight off, that I mean, like I think you're talking about a lot of players. I think they said, what was it, like there was 15 separate investigations going on.
It's a big number.
And, yeah, well, I mean, when you start looking at the sprawl on this stuff, it's really bad. And look, you're not gonna get. We're never gonna stop match fixing in China, which, by the way, goes on at the highest level in esports. Hate to break it to you all, but if you think those Dota games are legit, if you think those high level Chinese CS games are legit, you're completely wrong. They're not. And I don't even necessarily blame the players in a lot of those instances because it's Chinese organized crime. It's literally playing with a gun to your head. So, I don't even know how we could go about fixing that problem. What we needed to do was have things in place to make sure the problem never took hold, but we didn't do that. Even if the betting sites were to ban all of those MDL games, there's illegal Chinese betting sites that'll just run those games, and you have a private account, and no one can do anything about that now. No one can do anything about the Russian crime syndicates that are involved in betting. And again, yep, they're here, guys. Organized crime's here. It's already here. We're not keeping organized crime away from esports. They've been in esports for a while, and they're increasing their reach and increasing their hold. And trust me, I've talked to players who are terrified for their lives. Then they don't, some players have stopped playing altogether rather than be put in a position where it's throw a game or essentially defy the will of a fucking criminal. It's a complicated issue. It's a very complicated issue. What isn't complicated is what the motherfuckers in North America are doing. You've got money, you've got opportunity. There's no one holding a gun to their head. It's just greed. It's just pathetic, childish, amateurish greed. And when this report drops, like I hope it's scorched earth. I honestly hope Valve make a point of saying, in line with ESIC, all of those match fixes are permanently banned from all Valve tournaments. I hope every Counter-Strike tournament says, yep, they are banned as well, pending an appeals process. If they can prove they didn't do it or prove they did it once, maybe they get a 5-year ban. But from my understanding, these are systemic match fixes. These are people who have syndicates and groups. They're not throwing one game to save up money so they can go to fucking prom or whatever. They're throwing multiple games and working with multiple parties to make as much money as possible over as many games as possible, over as many seasons as possible. Fuck those people. That is who should be banned for life. iBuyPower, not so much. So, yeah, the ESIC investigation is going to be a big game changer in Counter-Strike terms. The slightly depressing aspect is a lot of these people will just fuck off to Valorant, and there'll be very little realistic material consequences for them. But if, say, the FBI or someone were to get involved, whew, different kettle of fish. If Uncle Sam comes a knocking, you're all fucked.
Yeah, and Riot's not going to be able to do much about that, nor would they really want to anyway. I mean, that is another angle to consider, though, is the fact that obviously if they go off to another game operated by another developer entirely, the jurisdiction there is sort of gray. People aren't really sure what should happen. Some people are worried that if they enforce some, they might have to logically enforce all, or all within a certain time frame, and that might impugn the iBuyPower players, the former iBuyPower players, who obviously still have that indefinite ban from Valve. And so, it's a bit of a tricky issue. Some people have said that they should just take people within the last year, or take people who have match fixed since Valorant's release date or something like that, and that would still catch a lot of these people. But the other concern is that this could result in a team of match fixers, even if they don't get picked up by other organizations, even if they don't get picked up by people who don't want to associate their brand with something as, ethically wrong as match fixing. These people might just band together and come up with some bedroom organization behind them, or just something similar to what we saw in Flashpoint with Orglis, except with the idea being that they could just go in and potentially win tournaments or place highly enough to still signal to the world that they are competing scot-free in a sense. What do you make of that?
It's a tough one. I think gets very difficult, doesn't it, when you want to sort of advocate for something holistic across all esports titles.
Yes.
Should somebody that match fixes in Dota be allowed to be a StarCraft player? Should someone who match fixed in StarCraft be allowed to be a professional Counter-Strike player? Like, are we maybe conflating, because Valorant and Counter-Strike are very similar games? Does that trick our brains into thinking, that it's more important that they should be punished rather than being allowed a fresh start? What I think would be interesting, and I know this is a potential outcome, is ESIC obviously talk to games developers, and they've held conversations with Riot, they've held conversations with Activision Blizzard. What I wonder is if Riot would be willing in some capacity to partner with ESIC, then, which Riot won't do this, by the way, guys, but if let's say they did decide, because holy shit, we're dealing with an FPS now, and there's a whole new, it's a new level of potential conflicts and not criminality, but rule breaking, stuff we've never encountered before. Maybe we should work with an independent body. Not they'll never surrender power. Riot Games always have to be in charge of everything they're associated with. But perhaps they could partner with ESIC to handle investigations on their behalf, or work in partner with their investigations. And then in which case, maybe that's how these players get banned, you see, because it wouldn't apply to the iBuyPower guys, because ESIC didn't exist when they were around, and Riot wouldn't be mirroring Valve's bans, they would be mirroring the ESIC bans. So they're not entirely out of the woods. I think that scenario is highly unlikely, but it's something that could happen. But I think ultimately you've probably got to say that the stuff they did in CS has to stay in that universe. And they probably do get away with it in the sense that if they go and they're successful in Valorant, there's no good reason for Riot to ban them from a business perspective, from the fairness perspective, from the issues it would open them up to potentially, like, even legal action maybe. It's a very tough one. So I think Riot will probably just let it slide and put the fingers in their ears and ignore it, and it'll be of great benefit to the development of the early stages of their competitive scene if they do that. So it's in their own interests, really, rather than to get involved. I think they'll come down on anyone match fixing in Valorant like a ton of bricks. We've already seen some allegations flying around that seem to have been cleared up very quickly. But yeah, I think in terms if you've cheated in CS, if you've match fixed in CS, you probably are just going to have a complete fresh start in Valorant, and you'll probably do very well in Valorant and make a lot of money in Valorant. It doesn't seem like justice, but it probably is what has to happen in the interests of fairness.
Yeah, the need for the many over the need for the few in that situation. We might have some people walk free, but at least nobody who's getting punished unfairly or some sort of miscarriage of justice the other way, where it's too sort of too draconian or too intense.
Exactly.
We're coming towards the back end of the interview, and one of the last things that I wanted to ask you about was tournament organizers, because I think that this is an angle. Obviously, people have been sort of talking about oversaturation of tournaments in Counter-Strike, and how there's just back-to-back tournaments where they all feel very similar. If it's like a DreamHack, or if it's at least the most recent DreamHack is a different talent roster, but if it's a IEM or ESL event, it's mostly the same talent roster, same studio, same sort of group of individuals behind it, but also the same feel of the tournament. A lot of people have had a difficult time sort of even some of the broadcast talent, like I've heard Machine say, which tournament is it again? And he sort of plays it for laughs, but in a way it's a very real sentiment that a lot of people have had. So my sort of question about the frequency of the tournaments that we've seen is I feel like this has been another sort of reason why people have failed to latch on to the severity of some of the investigations and the breaches of ethics that we've seen. Because ultimately what the fans are concerned with and what the fans are really interested in is watching their favorite players play and watching their favorite teams go, do well in tournaments, or if they don't do well, they sort of talk about that in wherever they talk about stuff. And, that's really what sets them abuzz. That's really what gets them interested in the game in the first place. And that's why we're all here. And in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to deal with any of these breaches of ethics. We wouldn't have to deal with coaches cheating or abusing bugs. We wouldn't have to deal with match fixing. But given the fact that this is a serious thing that we should at least focus on so that we don't have to deal with it in the future, and so that history doesn't repeat itself in the same way, I was curious as to your take about whether or not the tournament organizers themselves more or less play a role in sort of slowing pumping the brakes and slowing their role such that there can be an actual investigation. Should teams who had been impugned by ESIC been disallowed to take part in these tournaments? Should tournaments just have paused for a couple weeks so that we could really have sunk our teeth into this news and had it dominate the headlines a little bit more and sort of talk about that and have that be like the major thing that we're all talking about, rather than falling back on discussing tournaments while this really important thing was going out? I'm not sure if any of that is particularly realistic, but in a sort of world where you're behaving ethically, would that be something that the tournament organizers could have done to help shape this in a way that was more positive for the scene?
I think probably the only thing that wouldn't qualify as overreach would be saying, while the investigation is ongoing, the coaches are suspended from the tournament. I think that would have been about as far as I would have wanted them to go. Um, but the idea of like not allowing teams to compete, I mean, you essentially you potentially penalize the innocent there. And
Sure.
I don't think I don't think that satisfies anybody. You know, the reality is, sure, some players are very, very suspect. There's no doubt that a lot of the players at least got the benefit of the information in the game. So they didn't intend to cheat, but they felt the benefits of their coach cheating. You know, I think in general, like I say, unless you can 100% prove with a voice chat that they knew what was going on, you have to give the players the benefit of the doubt. The only ones that I've even contemplated being the exception of that are the hard Legion guys, because they've now had 3 coaches that have all abused the bug, and they are retaining the third and keeping him on board. Even after he said, "Yeah, I did it. Here's a video of me doing it. I don't really remember." You know, whatever. Not even an apology.
Yeah, well, that's an angle that you might be able to take on this then, because maybe one position that you said earlier about suspending individuals who were
Hmm.
impugned by this investigation, and that would have been something that wouldn't have been classed as overreach by tournament organizers. The question is then, like, should they have gone a step further and said you actually can't have this individual, like, I mean, I don't know how you would check this without admins, obviously, but in the room, operating with the team at all during the running time of the tournament, like, should they have been more demanding of making sure that these teams were meeting their ethical obligations to the scene by making sure that the impugned individuals were not at all a part of the team's success or failure at the tournament?
I think again, ultimately, I think the TOs did the right thing, just in terms of sitting back, allowing ESIC to conduct the investigation. And now that the investigation's been finalized, they're the ones that are going to sort of enact the bans. You know, ESL are saying none of these coaches that have been banned can be in the room and be around their tournaments and whatnot. You know, they can travel with the team, but they can't be on stage, they can't be on the server, they can't be in communication with them 15 minutes before the game starts. You know, and then they're going to enforce that. And as I said, I think that's about as far as I would want the TOs to go. I think when you get, if you buy into a project like ESIC, you have to take your hands off the wheel, you know, and let them do what they're trying to do. You can opt out if you're not happy with it and go back to doing these things yourself. But if you're going to buy into a third party disciplinary body that is out there conducting investigations and providing you with recommendations, I think you have to then say, okay, we commit to that idea, and they're the ones going to be calling the shots on this. So I think fair play, honestly, to the TOs in this sense. All of the partnered TOs have been very good in that regard, and I think that's the right way to handle it. And as I keep saying, I hope more tournament organizers will sign up to ESIC so they don't have to make the difficult third-party decisions themselves. They have a governing body that's conducting investigations that will handle it all for them. You know, there's no reason why Flashpoint shouldn't be working with ESIC. There's no reason why Faceit and, you know, I think the Blast actually do work with ESIC, so they're one of the ones that from outside MTG that do. But there's no reason why every tournament organizer shouldn't just be partnered with ESIC and working with ESIC at this stage, especially in Counter-Strike, where they've had a lot of success in dealing with the problems that the game faces, especially in an online era.
Well, we're at the end of the interview, and I wanted to ask if there was any final point or topic you wanted to leave us with, anything that you felt like maybe we should have talked about that we didn't get a chance to.
No, I'm super happy. Obviously, thanks for you know, hitting me up and taking the time to, you know, want to ask me my opinion on these issues. I find I'm doing more of the interviews these days than being the interviewee, so it's always nice to, you know, be able to just tee off and talk about things. So yeah, really appreciate the opportunity, and you know, best of luck on the content creation side, and I hope you get a lot of attention on the type of content you're creating, because you know, I enjoyed your last interview with Thorin that I watched.
Appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
No worries.